other facilities. Auschwitz, ironically, you made it to the work full, you had a better chance of surviving. They fed you because they wanted workers. They wanted people, able-bodied people who could make money for them.
All these people staying, what am I looking at? Hundreds of thousands of Jews in all these barracks. It's like work that they wake up. Just straight to work?
Yes, there was roll call. I mean, this is all pretty well documented. There was roll call, and there were.
What? Trying to figure out what to do.
You can see that they were only partly successful in covering their tracks. They destroyed what they could destroy. They destroyed the worst of it, the gas chambers and the crematoria. But the other elements were other things like barracks were kept standing. We'll see. There are some museum pieces here where they try to document and tell the story. The iconic gate, the entrance to train tracks, is over there. That's where people were brought. Because of the upcoming events, some of the camp is closed off to us. There is a tendency when it comes to this period to get focused on the details because there's so many of them, and some of the stories are gripping and interesting. So it's almost like you've got to weed through all of this information to try to come to terms to what actually took place. So where do we start? What do we say? What do we do? What are all these groups doing here? What are they feeling as they're walking around? Are they seeing this as an anthropological kind of a study? Wow. Do they talk about the depths of human evil? When secular Jewish groups come here, they focus on the evil of the Nazis, which is documented and clear and and broad evidence for us to witness. The Jewish view, very clearly, is when these kinds of things happen, is that we're responsible. That this is we've talked about this at breakfast, some of us, that in the Torah it spells out what's called the bracha and the klala, the blessing and the curse. And that if we keep Hashem's Torah and adhere to his mitzvahs and do what we're expected to do, Hashem is kind and gracious to the point of overwhelm. And when we don't, then this happens. I've guided Yad Vashem in the past where I'll simply take the psukim from Kisavo, one of the two sections in the Torah that describes the klala, the curse. It's the one that corresponds to our current exile. It's called Golus Edom. And you see the psukim, and then you look at the pictures of the wall, and you see what's going on is being described in the psukim. So that's how Jews see the world. We see that everything is here for us, to help us make the right choices. We have Bechira Chofshis, and we're supposed to use it in the service of Hashem. Choose life, choose good. And that's how we frame things. If you were to say this, if I had a group not like you, and I've guided other groups here, who's not religious, who are maybe children of survivors, they'll be furious with me. Are you insinuating, Rabbi, that somehow the victims were responsible for their own fate and weren't simply innocent sheep marched to their slaughter? And I don't mean any disrespect to any victim. I said, it's not me who's speaking. I'm speaking on the voice of tradition of the Torah to say that, yes, Jews see cause-effect. We believe that our behavior in this world directly leads to these kinds of situations.
How do you explain the Derech?
We see this sometimes. There were many of the Gedolim, this is predicted in the Gemara too, who actually died just on the just right before the Holocaust. So you had Rabbi Baruch Leibovich and Rav Shimon Shkop, with many of the great lights of Europe who passed away just in 1938, 1939, and they were spared. And sometimes you have the great Jews who also who are, in a sense, they go down with their flock, with the Jews themselves, and Hashem has his own system of justice. We don't have, look, these are big questions, and we can start to take them on. They really get into the question of what the secular philosophers call theodicy, which is what we call tzaddik v'ralo, rasha v'tovlo. Why, to our shallow perception, does it seem that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people? And how Hashem assesses things. The Jews takes a humble view of the fourth parak of Pirkei Avos, Rabbi Yanai, who teaches Ein biyadenu lo mishilvasa r'shayim. It's not in our hands ultimately to grasp neither the tranquility of the wicked, lo mi lo miyisuri hatzadikim, neither the suffering of the righteous. But we understand it all happens for a reason, and we accept it on that level. You realize this is a paradigm shift. The world doesn't see it in such terms. No, we will get to them. These are mostly barracks.
How far does this reach, just so we understand how big of a city we're talking about over here?
It's quite massive. We're going to try to walk through much of it.
Wait, can you explain what
Mostly barracks. These are mostly barracks. Now, when the Jews got off the train, they were initially greeted with what's called selection, in which the Nazis deemed who was fit for work and who was useless for their work, for their purposes. And the second group was immediately sent for what they say was showers and delousing, which we know was really the gas chambers and their death. That was the majority. A minority were selected for work, and those are the ones who survived, and they were taken to barracks. It wasn't just Jews, but it was predominantly where the Jewish people.
So they
murdered.
worked over here, like they built.
No, they slept here. They were kept here. They had different facilities here. Much of the work took place outside the camp, was rigorously guarded by the Nazi machine.
Did they shoot down there? What's the? All those like.
Yeah, also destroyed barracks and other facilities. They were also, this had to house all the Nazis and their families and it was a massive complex. They had factories outside. We said the third Auschwitz was called Auschwitz Mona, was a gas production factory, and they worked in the fields, and they did whatever. It was an evolving process. We look at this as if it was a set designed structure, when in fact it was something that evolved as the Holocaust proceeded. Nothing like this ever existed in the history of human beings. So the Germans, as maniacal and as brilliant as they were themselves, didn't quite know what they were doing, and they were constantly revising their plans.
Are we able to go into one of the barracks?
Yes.
Everyone takes a picture. Where is it? Is this the white thing? Yeah, it's the white thing. Not everything.
So the Auschwitz, there was a bold attempt to escape. Didn't end well. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but near the end, there were people who tried to escape. I think that they, in the end, were all rounded up. There was a more famous story of escape from Sobibor. So it's not like all the Jews were entirely passive, but sometimes today people look back at what happened and think, well, why did they go along? Why were they so passive, like sheep to the slaughter? And we could address that question. That's something. Maybe I should do it in front of the entire group. I'll wait a moment to address that. Train tracks where people came. This area, we'll see when this group moves, and they'll see the pictures of the selectia, of the selection that took place. The question is asked, how are the Jews so passive? I mean, we come through here and suddenly people start to flex their biceps and think, well, if I were here, I wouldn't be so passive. You have to realize that for centuries, the Jews had been, we told just one story of one massacre, the Khmelnytsky, the Cossack massacres in 1648-49 yesterday, but the Jews have been subjected to this virtually every single place they lived, in every generation, in every part of the world. Every one of our families were subjected to mass brutal treatment at the hands of their non-Jewish hosts, some better, some worse. And after centuries of this, the Jews resigned themselves for the almost futility. The more they would fight back, they perceived the more it would come out worse for them. When they asked surviving head of the Judenrat were the organizations in charge of the ghettos, who often were deemed with the task of having to send people to select which people were going to go to the camps. And they said, well, if the Nazis asked me to send 100, I'll save 1,000. So I'd rather send 100 Jews to their deaths knowingly and thereby maybe preserve the 1,000. Of course, that's a self-illusion, because the 1,000 were also eventually sent, as was he. Right? Most of these people themselves were rounded up in the end by the Nazis as well. But it was what people told themselves, and the sense of just complete helplessness, of futility, of fighting back, pervaded. That, plus the Germans, again, very cleverly, led a campaign from the early 30s when the Nazis rose in power. They led a campaign to dehumanize the Jews. Well, that was obviously very effective for the Germans, and then the other continent, the other nations across Europe, to make it feel that, you're actually doing humanity a service by getting rid of society's undesirables. Not just Jews, but predominantly Jews, and that anyway, they were perceived in all, if you look at all of the caricatures of this time, the Jews were perceived with horned noses and tails and horns. They were cockroaches and leeches. And you're just doing cockroach. They used terms of dehumanization. We weren't murdering. They were, what was the term that they used? What's that? They were liquidating. They were exterminating.
Cleansing.
Extermination was a common term because you have cockroaches, you want to exterminate them too. And that way the whole project became not only not distasteful, but actually something of a moral quest. Well, that actually had a psychological effect on the Jews themselves. And after being despoiled of all of their worldly possessions, after being shaved of all of their body hair and stripped, man, woman, and child, they too, in a sense, adopted that subhuman feeling that not only am I powerless to do anything to rise up to object, but they went along. They went along very much passively. Here's a picture of selection. The Germans committed every atrocity that had ever been committed against the Jews, and they invented many new ones. When a young boy, healthy and clearly full of confidence, was brought to Belzec, which is the same story as Auschwitz. We're not going to visit Belzec this trip. He looked around and he said, how do you suppose we can escape this place? Full of confidence that he was going to do it, and he was overheard by the German guards. And they took him and they stripped him, and they hanged him upside down for 3 hours. And because he was so stout and had such a ruach, such a spirit to live, he survived. So then they stuffed sand in his mouth until he suffocated.
No way.
So the idea that these people would protest, would be able to do anything, these were very hard things to swallow. To tell you, after having guided secular Israelis, they have a particularly hard time with this concept because in their ethos, their way of looking at life, of course, the whole narrative of the Israeli state is we took up arms against our enemies. We fought. If you see the early art, the art of Rappaport and others, of the iconic chalutznik of the Israeli culture, it's a muscled guy wearing shorts and sandals with a hoe in one hand to do the work and a gun in the other hand to shoot his enemies. And so the Israelis would perceive that their family, the Jews, 5.8 million of them, would go passively to their deaths as unthinkable, unspeakable. That's why, not randomly, in the early days of the state, when they knew they had to do something to commemorate the Holocaust, they selected as the Jewish Holocaust Day, actually I should say the Israeli Holocaust Day, because it's really a very un-Jewish Holocaust Day, was a random day, not really so random, to commemorate, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which took place during Pesach, where we'll be in Warsaw later on, when they were finally emptying the Warsaw Ghetto of the Jews took up arms and bravely resisted. It took place over Pesach. You can't have a Holocaust Memorial Day on Pesach, so they pushed it off to another date, and that was the day, because on some level, that way, it made the Israelis feel good that, we're rising up and we're protecting ourselves. And there were partisans in the forest who also fought the Nazis, and there were isolated such stories, but that was the exception, not the rule. Most of the Jews had really no chance and no real ability to resist. Just a quick editorial comment. The reason why I said before that Holocaust Day that was selected by the secular state is a problematic day is we understand what is the real Holocaust Day on the Jewish calendar. It's called Tisha B'Av because every bad thing, to reinforce the idea I tried to convey earlier, every bad thing to happen to our people from the days of the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, is an extension of that Churban. When you send because of our sins, we were exiled because of our sins. The Shechina went into exile kaviyachol in response to us. There's been what's called Hester Panim. If these are unfamiliar concepts, you must learn these things if you want to be an informed Jew. Hester Panim is a situation that we bring about by ignoring Hashem. So Hashem says, okay, if that's the way it is, he then hides his face, and this is what happens. And we understand that every single bad thing, you name it, every massacre, every Spanish Inquisition and expulsion, everything that happened to Klal Yisrael from that time till the present, including our current war we have with our neighbors around Eretz Yisrael, is an extension of the Churban until the Jews fix their ways. Meanwhile, the Nazis were acting agents, doing their part and following through on their evil. Let's continue. Many of you have asked questions. I put them off. I apologize. You'll remind me again. Let me just describe. The Jews were appointed to be capos. And the capo was the flunky of the Germans who did all the dirty work. So the Germans wouldn't have to get too humanly involved. And they would, once the people were selected for death, they would lead them over. It was all very, very systematically worked out. They were brought into a room called the changing room. Pictures were there on the walls to try to keep up there were signs of the Red Cross were all around to have a sense that they were in decent hands, and they were going for simple delousing. After all, they'd just been traveling and they had perhaps all kinds of problems, and they were going to be sanitized in these special showers. They would, every detail, they would pack them into the showers because the way Zyklon B works is that it's if you've seen them, they're simply pellets. They look like little rocks, little blue rocks that they went in, and they're activated by moisture. When you packed in the maximum number of people, first of all, the people were defenseless inside. They closed the doors and locked them, but they packed in the people, and that, of course, maximized human sweat and condensation in the air, and so the pellets were activated almost immediately. The chance of survival in the gas chambers was almost zero. There were some isolated stories of people surviving, but 20 minutes later they would open the door and there were mass dead bodies. And the same capos who were designated to do their dirty work had to then put the bodies onto carts, and then they took them to places like this. These are the destroyed remnants of the crematoria, which, of course, everything about this, it's hard for me to speak right now, because even though I've said these stories many times, still the nature of what I'm saying right now, how do I get it out of my mouth? The idea that a Jew is burned, just among the many atrocities here, we hold that a Jew must be buried properly, covenant mace, and that somebody who's burned, you have to tell assimilated family members that they cannot opt for cremation instead of burial, that what's going to be in the afterlife, if anything, for somebody who's burned. Now, these are people who are going against their will. Anus Rahmanit Patre, the Hashem forgives the Anus. They had no say in this, but the explicit desecration of human life, of the burning, they were just gone. You had 1.1 million Jews brought here, and they just vanished from the face of the earth. And all of this was done with a facility from 1942 till almost the very end. They tried to keep up the spokes. Hitler, in one of his last messages to his men, he said, "I encourage you, pour all of our resources into the destruction of world Jewry." We said yesterday in Hungary was the last and brutally and massively destroyed Jewish communities. They came here for the end. And he said everything has to go to this, so much so that they did not put their resources into defense, knowing that this would be their own suicide, but all that mattered was killing the Jews. We call this period, a secular name is Holocaust. It means, it's a reference to a pagan sacrifice from fire, and it actually was used first to describe what the British Jews had done to the Jews in the 12th century, and then was used periodically to describe such atrocities. The term Shoah comes from the Torah itself. We just had it in last week's Parsha. The term comes up. It's another term that's used, maybe one that's more tasteful from a religious perspective. Rav Neugershal Shlita, he says giving a name in itself is a problem from what we said before, because then it brackets it off and says this is somehow unique and different than anything else that took place. He says this is really all an extension of the Churban. But it was staggering what was done, and the term genocide didn't exist before. It was made up by a Canadian Jew named Raphael Lemkin in 1943 to put a name on what had happened here, because the idea that you were going to take man, woman, and child and round them up for total destruction was really something that came from Amalek. And was Germany actually Amalek? Was it a manifestation of Amalek? But this hatred that's supernatural, it defies the human explanation. With all the guides here, they can't really address the nature of the evil and what produced it, and how it was a self-destructive evil. They didn't mind going to their own deaths in order to destroy the Jews. Maybe the best, most apt name for it is by a Jewish historian named Lucy Davidovich. She called it simply the war against the Jews. Now it's true, other groups were targeted, but it was all about the Jews. Make no mistake about this. And so you have to realize this is somehow coming from some supernatural. There's a plan in all of this. Is this Milchemes Gog uMagog? Some want to suggest perhaps this was the last war before the end could happen. But to remind ourselves, Rav Asher Weiss says we come here for three reasons, one of which is to have profound empathy with Tzarasam Shel Yisrael, what our people experienced. And it was the people who were killed, and it was the people who survived, and it was all of us. We have to put ourselves there. And it was Sephardim and it was Ashkenazim. Different countries fared differently. Greece had a small Sephardi Jewish population, some 2,000 to 4,000 Jews, but they were all rounded up, and they were all sent to Auschwitz for their murder. It didn't matter if they were Sephardi or not. Others fared better. Ironically, Italy was one of the Axis powers, but the Italian Jews did better. Some got away, some were sent to the camps. One of the inmates who was on the work patrol and had certain control over who was sent where in the Selektia got a list of incoming people on the next train, and there was actually a posek in Auschwitz named Tzvi Hirsch Meisels, who published his Shilas and Shuvas after, much like Rav Ephraim Oshri published his after surviving the Kovno ghetto. And Rav Meisels was asked the following question here, perhaps a few meters from where we're standing. The father knew that his son was coming in and was not sure whether he's going to be selected for life or death. And he said, I have the potential to be able to switch my son to the line of life. It's really the trolley question, if you know the famous moral trolley question. I could take my son and designate him for life, but perhaps that might mean that would go against the Nazis' orders, and if I left things to go passively, he may then be taking the life of somebody else on the line. Can I intervene? Am I the guy in the railroad station? Can I actually change the route of the train so that it hits this one man as opposed to 5 other people? And Rav Meisels, he said in his tshuva, he was speechless. He simply couldn't look at the man. So the father said, I understand from the Rav's silence that Sheva Tasa Ya'adif, these are people, Erlich Yid, people with Torah in them. Not all of them, but a lot of these people had Torah in them. And he said, I understand from the Rav's silence that I'm not permitted to do anything actively. This will be my personal Akedah Yitzchak.
Standing here, all holding hands. The words Gam ki elech begates almodas. We're standing at the gates, literally, in the valley of Talmodas, of hell, of death. And we turn to Kadosh Baruch Hu and we say, even here I'm not afraid. Lo ira ra. I'm not afraid of the evil, because you are with me. I think that one of the things that's coming in, it's being insinuated, almost spoken out clearly, but let's speak it out clearly. As much as they tried with all of their evil to destroy and kill, they only had control over the physical. Lo ira ra ki ata imadi, these people who went up through this area that we are right now standing, they went straight up. Rabbi Bleiweiss pointed out earlier, if those that didn't hear, we're not going this year. Treblinka, right? There, they had a paroiches at the entrance to the gas chambers. It said, Zeh la Hashem tzadikim yavovo. This is the gate that tzadikim enter into. The Nazis with their cynicism were putting us down, stepping on us, using our Aron Kodesh. But what they didn't realize is this was the entrance. This was the way to go in, because we're not people that the physical is there in order to serve our spiritual. The Gashmius is there in order for us to use it to elevate ourselves into heights of Ruchnius. And the people that passed through here, it went straight up. Zeh Ashar LaHashem Tzadikim Yavovo. They passed through the Gam Ki Elech, and they had nothing to fear. Ki Ata Imadi. Gam Ki Elech.
Gam ki elech legei zalma veslo ila irara la 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 irara ki ata imadi Thank you, everybody.
We said most of continental Europe were involved in the destruction of the Jews. Happily, Vichy France sent most of its Jews to the death camp. Cooperated actively with the Germans. You have to remember that the Dreyfus trials and the Blum, the Prime Minister of France before the war was a Jew, and the French were raging anti-Semites, as they had been through most of history, and they cooperated. Virtually every country, even you think of Swiss was neutral, the Swiss were neutral, but Switzerland closed its borders to the Jews. You couldn't sneak in. There were arguably maybe three of continental Europe, 3 countries that had a noble record with regards to the Jews. I mentioned before, there was Italy, They were bodedim. There were some individual heroes. There's no question. Right in the middle of Germany, Countess Maria von Maltzen, who is a mistress of one of the high-ranking Nazi Party officials, hid in her own house in the planks under her living room Jews. She supplied them with food. They went out and they did partisan work in the day, and they went back and hid at night. One day she came back and she was shocked and terrified for him. One of the names was Hans Fischl, was the Jew who hid there. We know the story from him. He was saying, as if he never heard that the Nazis were out there trying to round him up. He was saying full throttle Kriya Shema. She said, shh. He said, no. So you have these stories. You have courageous non-Jews, no question. But they were the exception. In addition to Italy, who had a mixed record, Bulgaria, of all places, had something of a mixed record too. They also tried to save the Jews. And in one particular story that we have to have Akara Satov for, the Danes ferried virtually all 5,000 Danish Jews, to Sweden, which was neutral territory, to their safety. And they survived the war. But the world was complicit. A little-known episode, should be known, 1938. This was all brewing. The Nazis were not secretive about their ambitions. Of course, many people dismissed it. Even local Jews were in denial. Nah, it won't happen here. In the country of Heinrich Heine, who was a Jew who'd converted to Protestantism, like so many Jews converted in Germany, over half of them in the 19th century alone, converted outright. He wrote what was considered the German national poem called the Lorelei. And they said in the country of Heinrich Heine, it can't happen here. Everybody was in denial. Well, in a conference spearheaded by the American president FDR, the Evian Conference in South France, the world convened to try to talk about what should be done with the Jews. The Jews now were clamoring desperately for visas. Any country that would take them in. America said, no, we can't take really more than a pittance because we have no racist problem. We know that anti-Semitism is a virulent problem and we don't want to import it, the Americans said. Canadians said much worse. Canadians said, the Canadian was a big anti-Semite. He said, none is too many. The only country in the world that took, relative to their size, a large number of Jews was the Dominican Republic.
I heard Albania also took
No, Albania. Well, they were European, so they were murdered. The Jews in Albania, so they were not in a position to host Jews. Chaim Weizmann, who went on, Chaim Weizmann went on to become the first president of the state of Israel. He said after the Evian Conference that it proved one thing, that the world was divided into two places where Jews were no longer welcome and places where Jews could not enter. You got it? Mm-hmm. The famous stories, this is a whole other chapter, of the Ship of Fools. A whole book and movie was made called The Ship of Fools, of refugee boats of Jews trying to get in, trying to sail to safety somewhere. They tried Cuba, no, closed doors. They tried South America, nothing doing. They tried North America. They were sent back to Europe, where everybody on the Ship of Fools perished in concentration camps. Many such stories. The British, with their white paper that they administered in 1939, bowing to Arab demands, had a ridiculously low rate of acceptance of Jewish immigrants. And if you know, there are many movies are made about this, many stories of Jews trying to sneak in these boats of refugees. In one of the many tragic episodes, one of the Jews fighting torpedoed one of the boats and everybody drowned. Terrible, terrible tragedies taking place all during this period, and all showing great indifference to the Jewish people. Hitler watched on gleefully, understanding, especially after the Evian Conference, that the world was giving him silent thumbs up to his plans. Nobody wants the Jews. FDR was not an anti-Semite of any unusual dimensions. He was just a normal run-of-the-mill anti-Semite, and he was sitting pretty because he had the Jewish vote. For the Jews in post-Depression America at the time, they said it in Yiddish, the way they like to say it, Yidden Gläuben und drei Welt. Jews live in three worlds. Die Welt, this world, jene Welt, the world to come, und Roosevelt. They held Roosevelt was flawless, couldn't do any wrong. They're all liberal, assimilated Jews, all the Labor Party people, and the Labor Union people. And so Roosevelt was sitting pretty, and he was just the same anti-Semite as most of them. And He didn't do anything for the Jews. Of all the world's leaders up until the very, and I said they could have bombed Auschwitz. They did not bomb Auschwitz. It's a question till today. What were they thinking? Once the atrocities were known, right? They would have headlines because the headline, of course, sells newspapers. They had headlines in the Boston Globe and the New York Times. Worst mass murder perpetrating right now. And then they buried the story. There's no like information about it. Nobody. They just wanted. Oh wow, just for the sensationalism, right? People knew what was happening and they did nothing. Not nothing. There were heroes, mostly from Jews. The refugee, the Bergson group, and then the Agudas Yisrael and other heroes were working tirelessly to try to campaign to help the Jews to have food drops to the ghettos, to try to campaign, to try to get people visas to immigrate. They succeeded, Baruch Hashem, against the initial American plan. They succeeded in getting 200,000 refugees into America. Perhaps some of our own family members were among those 200,000 who managed to get in. So there were some exceptions. Of the world leaders, the only positive world figure who deserves a mention here is, Winston Churchill. Churchill, who was, Britain is a weird combination of extreme anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism throughout their history. And Churchill was an example of the latter, in which he tried to campaign in the British Parliament to try to bomb Auschwitz, try to save the Jews. The British pushed back, and they won, even though he was the prime minister. What you hear then in the world is a conspiracy of silence to stop any of this, lest we point too many fingers. We have to realize that much of the world, and I'll even then broaden this and include a couple other groups you wouldn't expect in this list, and they would be the overwhelming majority of the American Jewish establishment. Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss, and I call him Rabbi like Rav Moshe would call the Reform rabbis, Resh Aleph Beis Aleph Yud, not Rav. But Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss says, we are not in a position to jeopardize our own position in American societies to reach out to to Jews overseas. As if he said that.
Reform rabbi.
Okay, it wasn't just Stephen S. Weiss. The overwhelming consensus is, shh, it could happen here. Shah, be quiet. That was the average, with exception of the Frum, and people who were plugged into Klal Yisrael, understand Kol Yisrael, Arevim Zelazeh, we're all in this together. There was a conscious putback. They said, you cannot have food drops. They think that we care about each other. They didn't say that, but that was the gist of it, right? Unless you thought it stopped with the American Jews. The World Zionist Organization centered in Palestine at the top, including this Chaim Weizmann that I just quoted, consciously resisted efforts. And Weizmann himself said, if so many old Jews go to their camps, well, I'm trying to get the quotation just right. He said, well, that's just the way it is in the cruel world that we live in. And it's so much collateral damage. As the Brisker Rav said, in reacting to the Zionist indifference or passivity in the face of the slaughter of all the Jews, they were, he described, very much like the Dor HaFlaga, the generation that built the tower to fight Hashem under Nimrod, in which, you remember the Medrash says, as they were building the tower, countless slaves fell to their death. But that was so much collateral damage. Okay, what do you expect? That's what's going to be. So human loss did not affect them. When a brick fell, then they all cried, because that was affecting the process. In this case, sometimes people become so set on their goals. In this case, the creation of a Jewish state. The concern, and it wasn't a cruel concern, but it was a very singular concern. Was everything has to be done for the creation of a Jewish state. We cannot stick our necks out and alienate the world opinion. They'll think somehow negatively of us. The British, the Americans, whoever, UN will not help us form this Jewish state if we in any way participate and try to save Jews. There were exceptions. If you know Jabotinsky, who's the ideological founder of the Likud party, he had all kinds of ambitions to come, and he told Jews of Europe before the Holocaust to get out. He had rescue missions planned. There were Jews who courageously parachuted. There's a Zionist icon named Chana Senesh, who was also a poet, who, like many others, actually safe in Palestine, parachuted into Yugoslavia at the time, and was caught by the Nazis and was tortured and murdered. Many such stories as well. Overwhelming situation. The idea I'm trying to convey right here is Thomas here?
Yeah. I'm looking on the watch.
I know. I'm waiting for you. Good. Let's go. If they stole from the Jews, going to their deaths, and each one of these were storage houses for different items. You see the women being stripped and have all of their things taken. Tomorrow in Majdanek we'll see much more of this in action. We'll see enormous rows and rows and rows of shoes.
Cutler. One place over there, there's some cutler over there.
Uh-huh.
Knives.
Yeah, cutlery.
forks.
People had their lives with them. They carried everything in their suitcases, and they were all sorted
They were
out.
told that they were going to be moving somewhere
You know,
else.
Yeah.
each Jew was allowed, even encouraged, to bring one suitcase up
Yeah.
to 20 kilo of luggage.
Right.
So if you multiply 20 kilo by million people at least,
Staggering number. Staggering
it's
amount of
like
material.
20,000 tons of possession. Yes, and
Daniel, you asked about how they afforded all this. The Jews, as we saw, financed much of their machine.
And here was a building where those who were sent to the camp, they enter and stage by stage, like
Dehumanized.
register.
This is where we described how they were shaved of their body hair,
Yeah.
and they were gold fillings were taken from their mouths.
Where's Mengele?
Mengele is coming around the corner. What's coming around the corner? We'll talk about Dr. Jeff, who was here. Who did sadistic experiments on inmates. Soon. Mengele is around the corner.
What's this?
Let's keep going. It's very good. We didn't spend a lot of time.
yeah, it's a surprise.
I know. Yeah, I think so. That's over there that they burn the bodies. This also it doubled as a gas chamber and a crematorium.
What? Tomasz, what's this for?
No, killing people is so complicated. After they had heaps of bodies who were just murdered in the gas chambers, what do you do with the bodies? They would put them in ovens. It's called crematoria, cremating them, reducing them to ashes. They can dispose of them more easily. What do you do with these, these millions of people?
You know, there are two kinds, maybe that's less important, like a logistic of the killing, but deception, that's what I want to tell you. In 44, especially 44, during the deportation of Hungarian Jews, sometimes 3-4 trains arrived per day, and it happened not once, but that there was a group inside who was being gassed, and there was a group of Jews who were kept in the train. So the Germans didn't want to create panic. They want to pretend that they'll be sent to a labor to work. So after the selection, those Jews would march and make a sit-in in the forest, in this forest, and the Germans allowed them to keep pots with food and they we know from the pictures, and at the time the Germans took the pictures, so on the way back we showed the pictures, and in one of the pictures you can see men and women sitting separately, children were playing, and they were like awaiting the disinfection process, the Germans said, and there were only 2-3 guards, nobody was completely aware, and certain
It was psychological. It was mind control.
yeah, and certain point the Germans would send the commandant enforcement many guards, and in a few groups they were forced to undress in the forest, and they were driven, beaten with dogs, vicious dogs, to this place. They enter this door, and there are you can imagine this two walls inside. There is division, internal division. There are gas chambers. Yes, and they're locked here, and they are cast. After few hours, the bodies were burned outside. Yeah, that's what happened here. And Germans were very meticulous about planning. Like this building doesn't look terrible, you know. Like in the
Right.
in the
It was
like,
quiet.
quiet.
There was no noise going on here.
No, during the gassing, there were some people cried, yes, screams.
So the others didn't hear. They kept away
Yeah,
the
but
panic?
keep in mind that the gassing took place usually in the day hours, and majority of the persons were outside in different factories working.
So the noise was stifled. You
Yeah,
didn't hear the
yeah.
noise. You didn't hear
And
the noise.
also along this road we took, there was fence.
In Treblinka, it wasn't this open area like you have in Auschwitz. In Treblinka, they were all funneled into this place. There was no option for escape. They had the train tracks. They got off the train and it said, next stop,
Yeah.
Moscow, or whatever it was.
Bialystok.
Right,
Yeah.
Bialystok, where my family's from. And, but then they were funneled in, and it was there. They had one guard, Ivan the Terrible, who committed atrocities. He would randomly slice out people's noses and ears. They would deliberately collect. They would immediately select the toughest, youngest men and immediately send them to the gas chamber so that nobody fit would be able to rebel. And the people there heard what was going on, and they screamed and cried. But at that point, they were powerless to do anything. People soiled themselves and were besides themselves. But at that point, they were stripped. And they were in Treblinka. Were there any survivors?
Well, there were those who took part in the revolt.
Yes,
It's,
in Treblinka, yeah.
And also single people who escaped. So those who from the work brigade.
Yeah, yeah. But those are the exceptions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Go ahead, quick.
Fine. It's my wife's grandfather grew up up in Auschwitz down the road. Family ended up here. Family up there. He was in another camp, and he tells the story that there was an announcement they all have to go someplace. He saw his parents being shipped off and ended up here. He ended up jumping out of an attic with his sister, going someplace. He was here at one point, but he survived because he worked. He was an electrician. He made flashlights. And he had labor. He was part of writing memoirs of people who survived Auschwitz, and there was a book, and he wrote his memoirs. And there's a story in that memoirs of the dancing chassid, and of people who survived, eyewitness. And main part of the story is when the situation declined, there was a group of Jews that were planning not how to live, but how to die as Jews. And they developed an understanding and appreciation of Makayim the mitzvah Kiddush Hashem. And thereby, wherever they were going, whatever cattle car they were on, they were singing and singing, always singing. And they swore to each other that they would not, God forbid, succumb to mental weakness in any last moment. There was someone known as the dancing chassid. What did you do? What did you do? So there was a bunch of Bachman that came from the Lodz ghetto that worked on themselves. Keep it short, and singing. And they got here to Auschwitz. This is an eyewitness story. They got here. And they were dancing, singing. And the guards, the Lager commandant, the overseer of the crematorium, says, whose eyes seen him, says, what are they doing? What's going on? Who are they? And they're young Hasidim. That is what they're doing. They're looking for the reward in Olam Haba, and they're singing. These ones, he said, I will not exterminate. I will not. I am not going to let them have the world that they want to have. And they came and they would say, you go there, you don't go in. And they sang and they danced and they asked to go in. They wouldn't go in. Eventually. And they were singing. Ashreinu Matel Chokenu. And some eventually didn't make it. This known as the dancing chassid was seen as a very skinny, even depressed person. And when he was asked why he was depressed, he says, because they didn't let me die on Kiddush Hashem. They didn't let me. These are the people. People that wanted to go in. They weren't allowed.
Okay, we have to go. We have to go. You should know we did this one year. Ari Schwimmer started it all those years ago, and this particular Nigun, and we were dancing, and we were an Israeli tour guide came over and says, "This is not what you do here." And I didn't get into him, but I looked at the guys and I said, "This is what we do here." You can write on your book. I mean, we got it.
We don't need no tickets guys now. We can go.
This is going on the extras.
Robin, it counts as a Holocaust.